The day they finally believed me was the day nobody could look me in the eye. My name is Margaret Collins. I was 69 years old when my family sat around Ryan's dining room table and realized that everything I had been trying to tell them for months was true. The silence in that room felt heavier than anything I had ever experienced. Ashley sat at one end of the table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. Ryan stood near the kitchen doorway, staring at a stack of papers as if they belonged to someone else's life. My sister, my nephew, and two longtime family friends were there as well. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The only sound came from the refrigerator humming quietly in the background. A few minutes earlier, everyone had been certain I was the problem. They had believed I was stubborn, dramatic, and unwilling to accept my son's marriage. They had spent months explaining my concerns away. Every warning I gave had been treated like the complaint of a lonely widow who simply could not let go. Yet now the truth sat in front of them in black and white. Printed emails, messages, dates, timelines, details nobody could argue with. I remember looking around the room and realizing that nobody seemed angry anymore. They looked shocked, confused, embarrassed. It was the kind of silence that only appears when people suddenly understand they have been wrong for a very long time. Ryan finally lifted his eyes toward me. For months he had avoided doing that. Whenever I tried to talk to him, he found a reason to leave the room or change the subject. Now he looked directly at me, and the expression on his face broke my heart. Not because he was angry, because he looked disappointed in himself. Ashley stared down at the table. The confidence she normally carried so easily seemed to have vanished. I should have felt victorious. I should have enjoyed the moment after everything I had endured. Instead, I felt tired, deeply tired, because being right had cost me far more than I ever wanted to pay. It had cost me holidays, phone calls, family dinners, time with people I loved. The truth had finally arrived, but it had arrived late, very late. I reached for my coffee cup and noticed my hand trembling slightly, not from fear, from relief. Months of doubt and isolation were finally coming to an end. Nobody needed another explanation from me. Nobody needed another argument. The facts spoke clearly enough. As I sat there watching everyone struggle to process what they were seeing, my mind drifted back to where all of this had started. 6 months earlier, life looked completely different. Ashley was the person everyone admired. Ryan trusted her completely. Family gatherings were filled with laughter and easy conversations. If someone had told me back then that we would all end up sitting in that room questioning everything we believed, I would have laughed. Yet that was exactly where we were. Because 6 months earlier, I began noticing things that nobody else seemed able to see. Small things, tiny details, the kind most people dismiss. At first, I dismissed them too. I wish I had trusted my instincts sooner. 6 months earlier, there was nothing remarkable about our family. At least that was how it appeared from the outside. Ryan and Ashley lived in a beautiful 2-story home outside Indianapolis. They had been married for almost 8 years. Their lives seemed comfortable and stable. Friends admired them. Neighbors liked them. Family gatherings were easy and predictable. Ashley especially had a gift for making people feel welcome. She remembered birthdays, organized holiday dinners, and always seemed to know exactly what to say. I liked her too. That is probably the hardest part of this story for people to understand. I did not begin with suspicion. I did not dislike my daughter-in-law. In fact, for years I defended her whenever anyone criticized her. The first thing that caught my attention was so small that I almost forgot about it. One Sunday afternoon, Ryan mentioned a conversation he supposedly had with me about Thanksgiving plans. The problem was that conversation had never happened. At first I thought he was confused. I gently corrected him and moved on. A week later, something similar happened again. Ashley referenced a comment she claimed I had made during a family dinner. Once again, I knew I had never said it. The moment passed quickly, and nobody seemed concerned. Neither was I. People misremember things all the time. Yet over the next few weeks, those moments became more frequent. Small details, tiny inconsistencies, stories that shifted ever so slightly depending on who was telling them. One evening, my sister called to ask whether I was upset with Ashley. The question surprised me. When I asked why, she hesitated. Eventually, she admitted that Ashley had mentioned feeling unwelcome around me recently. I sat quietly at my kitchen table holding the phone, genuinely confused. Nothing had happened between us. At least nothing that I was aware of. After we ended the call, I stared out the window for a long time. Outside, Children rode bicycles down the street while sprinklers clicked across neatly trimmed lawns. Everything looked normal, yet I could not shake the feeling that something was off. Christmas brought another strange moment. During a family dinner, Ashley told a story about a disagreement we supposedly had months earlier. Several relatives nodded sympathetically as she spoke. The problem was that her version barely resembled what had actually happened. She was not telling an outright lie. The basic event was real, but the details had changed. Certain parts were emphasized. Others were missing entirely. The story painted a picture that felt unfairly flattering to her and strangely unkind to me. I remember looking around the table and realizing nobody else noticed. Why would they? They had no reason to question her. Later that night, I tried mentioning it to Ryan. His reaction caught me off guard. He immediately became defensive. He told me I was overthinking things. He said Ashley had been under stress lately and that I should not take everything so personally. I let the subject drop. But as I drove home beneath the cold winter sky, a difficult thought entered my mind for the first time. What if these incidents were not isolated? What if they were connected? I did not have answers yet, only questions. Still, something deep inside me kept whispering the same warning. Pay attention. Remember the details. One day they might matter. The more attention I paid, the more difficult it became to ignore what was happening. By February, I noticed a change in the way people spoke to me. It was subtle. Nobody was openly rude. Nobody confronted me directly. Yet conversations felt different. Friends who once called regularly seemed distant. Relatives who usually shared family news now sounded careful, almost guarded. One afternoon, I stopped by a coffee shop to meet a longtime friend named Linda. We had known each other for more than 20 years. Normally, our conversations flowed easily from one topic to another. That day felt different from the moment I sat down. Linda seemed uncomfortable. She stirred her coffee several times before finally looking at me. "Margaret, can I ask you something?" she said. I nodded. She hesitated before speaking again. "Are things all right between you and Ashley?" My stomach tightened immediately. I asked why she would think otherwise. Linda looked embarrassed. She admitted that Ashley had mentioned feeling judged by me on several occasions. According to Ashley, she had spent years trying to build a relationship with her mother-in-law while receiving criticism in return. I sat quietly and listened. What shocked me was not the accusation itself. It was how sincere Linda sounded. She genuinely believed she was discussing a difficult family situation. Ashley had never presented herself as angry or resentful. She presented herself as hurt. That distinction mattered. Hurt people receive sympathy. Hurt people are trusted. Driving home that afternoon, I replayed the conversation repeatedly. I realized Ashley was not telling dramatic stories. She was planting impressions. Small impressions that grew over time. A few weeks later, another incident occurred. Ryan invited me to dinner at their house. During the meal, Ashley mentioned a conversation she claimed had happened between us months earlier. Once again, the details were wrong. Not completely wrong, just altered enough to change the meaning. I corrected her politely. The room became awkward for a moment. Then Ryan immediately stepped in. He suggested everyone might simply remember things differently. The subject changed, but I noticed something important. Ashley never argued when I corrected her. She simply smiled sadly and let others draw their own conclusions. Later that evening, I sat alone in my living room with a notebook on my lap. For the first time in my life, I began writing things down. Dates, conversations, events. Not because I planned to prove anything. I simply wanted to keep track of what was happening. Deep down, I was afraid that if I did not record the details, I might eventually begin doubting myself. As winter slowly turned toward spring, the distance between Ryan and me became harder to ignore. Phone calls grew shorter. Visits became less frequent. When I invited him to lunch, he often seemed too busy. I told myself life was complicated. People had responsibilities. Yet part of me knew something else was happening. Every time I expressed concern about Ashley, the gap widened a little more. One evening, after another brief conversation with Ryan, I sat at my kitchen table staring at my notebook. Several pages were already filled with observations. Looking at those notes, I felt a mixture of sadness and determination. I still did not know exactly what Ashley was doing. I only knew that the version of me being presented to other people did not resemble reality. And for the first time, I understood that if I wanted anyone to believe me someday, I would need more than intuition. I would need facts. By April, my notebook had become part of my daily routine. Every evening, I sat at the same spot near my kitchen window and recorded anything that felt unusual. Most entries were short. A comment, a date, a conversation. Looking back, it seemed almost ridiculous. I was a retired school administrator, not an investigator. Yet something inside me kept insisting that the details mattered. One Saturday afternoon, I attended a family barbecue hosted by my nephew. The weather was beautiful. Children ran through the backyard with water balloons while adults gathered beneath a large patio canopy. It should have been a pleasant day. For the first hour, everything felt normal. Then I overheard a conversation that made my heart sink. Two relatives were discussing a disagreement they believed had happened between Ashley and me. They spoke confidently, as though the story were common knowledge. The problem was that most of the story had never happened. Certain pieces were recognizable. Others had clearly been added along the way. I stood there holding a paper plate and realized something disturbing. The story was evolving as it traveled from person to person. Later that afternoon, I found myself sitting beside my cousin Rebecca. She lowered her voice and asked whether Ashley and I had ever resolved our issues. I asked what issues she meant. Rebecca seemed surprised by the question. According to her, Ashley had been struggling for years with my criticism and disapproval. Years. That word echoed in my mind. I managed a polite smile and changed the subject, but the conversation stayed with me for days. When I returned home, I opened my notebook and began reviewing older entries. Patterns slowly emerged. The same themes appeared repeatedly. Ashley rarely accused me of anything specific. Instead, she created an impression. She suggested. She implied. She hinted. Each individual comment seemed harmless. Together, they formed a narrative. The more I studied my notes, the more I understood why confronting her directly would never work. There was no single dramatic accusation to disprove. There were dozens of small distortions spread across months and years. A week later, another incident strengthened my suspicions. Ryan called to cancel a lunch we had planned. He sounded distracted. Before ending the call, he casually mentioned something Ashley believed I had said about her. Once again, the statement was unfamiliar. I told him I never said it. There was a long pause. Then he sighed and said, "Mom, I do not know why you two keep remembering things differently." After we hung up, I sat quietly in my living room staring at the blank television screen. For the first time, I realized Ryan was no longer evaluating information for himself. He was simply trying to avoid conflict. Unfortunately, that meant accepting the version of events presented to him most often. That night, I made an important decision. I stopped trying to persuade anyone. I stopped defending myself. Instead, I focused entirely on documentation. I organized old emails. I saved messages. I printed photographs with visible dates. If a conversation felt important, I recorded the details immediately afterward. The process was not driven by anger. It was driven by clarity. Deep down, I had begun to understand something that nobody else seemed willing to see. The truth was still there. It was simply buried beneath months of assumptions. And if I wanted anyone to recognize it someday, I would need to uncover it one piece at a time. The breakthrough arrived when I least expected it. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early May. I had spent most of the day planting flowers in my backyard when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Olivia Reed. At first, the name meant nothing to me. Then she explained that she had worked with Ashley several years earlier. My attention sharpened immediately. Olivia sounded nervous. She apologized for calling unexpectedly and said she had been debating for weeks whether to contact me at all. We spoke for nearly an hour. By the time the conversation ended, I understood why. Olivia never attacked Ashley. In fact, she was remarkably careful with her words. What she described was not a dramatic scandal or a shocking secret. It was a pattern. According to Olivia, Ashley had a habit of positioning herself as the misunderstood person in difficult situations. Small workplace disagreements somehow evolved into larger conflicts. Coworkers often heard different versions of the same event. Managers received one explanation while colleagues received another. Nothing seemed serious enough to trigger formal complaints, yet relationships frequently became strained afterward. As Olivia spoke, I felt an uncomfortable sense of familiarity. The details were different, but the process sounded remarkably similar to what I had been experiencing. Before ending the call, Olivia mentioned something else. Several former coworkers had eventually compared stories and discovered inconsistencies in the timelines Ashley presented. That observation stayed with me long after we hung up. Later that evening, I sat at my dining room table reviewing my notebook once again. For months, I had focused on individual incidents. Now I began examining them as a whole. The more I looked, the clearer the pattern became. Ashley rarely invented events completely. Instead, she reshaped them. A disagreement became criticism. A misunderstanding became rejection. A forgotten detail became evidence of disrespect. The changes were subtle enough to avoid scrutiny, but significant enough to alter how people felt about the situation. A few days later, I received an email from Olivia. Attached were several old messages from years earlier. Nothing in them was dramatic, yet they demonstrated something important. The same event had been described differently to different people. Reading those messages felt like finding another missing piece of a puzzle. For the first time, I had confirmation from someone completely outside our family. Meanwhile, my relationship with Ryan continued to deteriorate. When I called, conversations felt rushed. When I suggested meeting for lunch, he usually declined. One evening, I finally asked whether something was wrong. There was a long pause before he answered. Then he gently suggested that perhaps Ashley and I simply viewed the world differently. The comment hurt more than I expected, not because it was cruel, because it revealed how far apart we had become. He no longer questioned the stories he heard. He simply accepted that they represented reality. After that call ended, I walked into my home office and opened a new folder. Every email, photograph, note, and message I had collected went inside. I organized everything chronologically: dates, conversations, events, patterns. Looking at the growing stack of documents, I realized something important. For months, I had been hoping people would eventually notice the truth on their own. Now I understood that would never happen. The truth needed structure. It needed context. And if the day ever came when someone was willing to listen, I intended to be ready. By June, I had stopped wondering whether my instincts were correct. The evidence had already answered that question. What remained uncertain was whether anyone else would be willing to look at it. Most mornings followed the same routine. I made coffee, sat at my dining room table, and reviewed the growing collection of documents inside the folder I kept beside me. Emails were sorted by date. Photographs were labeled. Notes from conversations were organized chronologically. The process was tedious, but it brought clarity. Every time I reviewed the material, another connection appeared. Another inconsistency surfaced. Another piece of the larger picture became visible. One afternoon, I received a call from my niece, Emily. We had always been close. Unlike some other relatives, she still checked in regularly. During our conversation, she casually mentioned something Ashley had told her a few weeks earlier. The story sounded familiar because I had already heard a different version from someone else. After ending the call, I compared my notes. The timelines did not match. The details did not match. Yet both stories described the same event. I added another page to the folder. A few days later, I attended a church luncheon. It was the kind of gathering I had enjoyed for years. People brought casseroles, desserts, and homemade bread. Conversations drifted from grandchildren to gardening to local news. At one point, a woman I knew approached my table and asked how things were going with Ryan and Ashley. The question itself was not unusual. What surprised me was the concern in her voice. She clearly believed there had been tension for a long time. As we talked, I realized she had heard yet another version of the same narrative. Not dramatic, not hostile, just enough to create a particular impression. Driving home afterward, I found myself thinking about how easily perceptions are formed. Most people do not investigate every story they hear. They trust the person telling it. That realization no longer upset me. In a strange way, it helped me understand why everything had unfolded as it had. Around that same time, Ryan and I spoke briefly on the phone. The conversation was polite but distant. Near the end, I asked whether he would be willing to meet for lunch. There was a pause. Then he said he was busy and would let me know when his schedule opened up. We both knew that was unlikely to happen. After hanging up, I sat quietly for several minutes. The distance between us hurt. It always would. Yet for the first time, I noticed something different. I was no longer desperate to convince him. Months earlier, I would have rushed to explain everything I had discovered. Now I understood that people rarely change their minds because of one conversation. They change when they are ready to examine the facts themselves. That evening, I expanded the timeline I had been building. Events from years earlier now connected to incidents from recent months. Patterns that once seemed random suddenly looked consistent. The folder had become more than a collection of documents. It had become a record of reality. Looking at it spread across my dining room table, I realized the story was no longer about proving I was right. It was about preserving the truth. And if the day ever came when someone finally asked to see what I had found, I intended to be ready with every date, every message, and every detail exactly where it belonged. By July, something unexpected began happening. For the first time since this ordeal started, I was no longer the only person noticing inconsistencies. The change was subtle at first. Small comments, hesitations during conversations, questions that had not existed before. One evening, my niece Emily called again. We spent several minutes talking about ordinary things before she suddenly asked whether I remembered a particular family gathering from the previous year. I told her I did. Then she explained that she had recently heard two completely different accounts of what happened that day. One version came from Ashley. The other came from someone else. Emily sounded puzzled rather than suspicious. That distinction mattered. People become defensive when they think they are being asked to choose sides. Curiosity is different. Curiosity opens doors. After we ended the call, I made another note in my folder. The list of contradictions was growing steadily. A week later, another development occurred. My cousin, Rebecca, invited several relatives to her home for a casual summer cookout. I almost declined. Family gatherings had become emotionally exhausting. In the end, I decided to go. Avoiding everyone would only make the situation worse. The afternoon began pleasantly enough. Children played in the yard while adults gathered beneath shade umbrellas. For a while, conversations remained light and comfortable. Then I noticed something unusual. Ashley seemed more active than normal in directing conversations. Whenever certain topics surfaced, she quickly shifted attention elsewhere. Whenever someone mentioned an old family event, she often stepped in with her own interpretation before anyone else could speak. Under ordinary circumstances, I might not have noticed. But after months of documenting patterns, the behavior stood out immediately. What struck me most was not what Ashley said. It was how hard she seemed to be working to maintain control of the narrative. Later that afternoon, I found myself standing near the patio with two relatives discussing an old holiday gathering. As the conversation unfolded, both realized they remembered the same event differently because they had been told different stories afterward. Neither person sounded angry. They simply looked confused. Watching their reactions, I felt something shift. For months, I had carried this burden alone. Now other people were beginning to ask questions on their own. Around that same time, I received another email from Olivia. She had recently reconnected with a former coworker who remembered several incidents involving Ashley. The coworker shared examples of situations where different people received different explanations for the same disagreement. Once again, there was nothing dramatic. No shocking revelation. Just a familiar pattern. By now, the consistency itself had become impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Ryan remained distant. Yet even he seemed different during our occasional conversations. He no longer defended Ashley quite as quickly. He no longer dismissed my concerns immediately. Instead, he often responded with silence. At first, I interpreted that silence as frustration. Eventually, I realized it might represent uncertainty. For the first time, he was beginning to encounter information that did not fit neatly into the story he had accepted. One evening, after organizing several new documents, I spread the entire timeline across my dining room table. Looking at it all together, I understood something important. The truth was no longer hidden. It was sitting plainly in front of anyone willing to examine it. The challenge was no longer finding evidence. The challenge was creating an opportunity for people to see it. And deep down, I had a feeling that opportunity was coming much sooner than anyone expected. The opportunity arrived on a quiet Thursday evening in late August. I was watering flowers on my front porch when Ryan called unexpectedly. The moment I heard his voice, I sensed something had changed. He sounded tired. Not angry. Not defensive. Just exhausted. After a few minutes of uncomfortable conversation, he admitted that several relatives had approached him with questions. Different people were comparing stories and noticing inconsistencies. Details did not match. Timelines conflicted. Certain events seemed impossible when viewed side by side. Ryan said he wanted everyone together in one room so the confusion could finally be addressed. We agreed to meet the following Saturday evening at his house. During the days leading up to the gathering, I remained surprisingly calm. I spent Friday organizing my timeline one final time. Emails, messages, photographs, notes, screenshots. Everything was arranged chronologically inside a large binder. By then, I knew the evidence well enough to find any document within seconds. Saturday arrived warm and clear. As I drove through Ryan's neighborhood, children played basketball in driveways and families worked in their yards. The ordinary nature of the day felt strange considering what was about to happen. When I entered the house, several relatives had already arrived. The atmosphere was tense. Conversations were short. Smiles looked forced. Ashley, however, appeared confident. She greeted everyone warmly and moved through the room with her usual ease. Watching her, I realized she probably believed the evening would unfold the way every previous conversation had unfolded. She expected people to trust her. Eventually, Ryan gathered everyone around the dining room table. Once everyone settled into their seats, he explained that too many conflicting accounts had surfaced and that he wanted clarity. For several moments, nobody spoke. Then Ashley began talking. Calmly and confidently, she described years of misunderstandings. She spoke about feeling hurt, feeling judged, feeling unwelcome. Her delivery was polished and familiar. Several times she glanced toward Ryan as she spoke. He listened carefully and nodded more than once. As she continued, I realized something important. Despite the growing doubts surrounding the situation, Ryan still wanted to believe her. He still hoped there was an explanation that would preserve the version of reality he had accepted for so long. When Ashley finished, Ryan looked toward me. Before I could even open the binder, he spoke. He said that documents and dates could be interpreted in different ways. He reminded everyone that misunderstandings happen in every family. Part of him was still trying to protect the conclusion he had already reached. I understood that. Nobody abandons deeply held beliefs in a single moment. Quietly, I opened the binder and removed the first document. I began with one simple event, a family gathering, one date, one email. Then I placed a photograph beside it. The timeline did not match Ashley's account. Ryan immediately suggested there might be another explanation. So I showed a second document, then a third, then a fourth, each piece connected to the previous one. Different versions of the same event, different dates, different descriptions given to different people. Ryan continued searching for explanations at first. I watched him pick up pages and compare them repeatedly. But as more evidence accumulated across the table, his confidence began to fade. The room grew quieter. Relatives leaned forward. Questions emerged. By the time I reached the middle of the binder, nobody was debating anymore. They were examining, comparing, thinking. And for the first time since this entire ordeal began, Ryan was no longer defending a story. He was confronting facts. The silence that followed felt unlike anything I had ever experienced. One by one, family members examined the documents spread across the table. Nobody argued. Nobody interrupted. The evidence did not demand belief. It simply existed. Emails showed conversations occurring on dates that contradicted later claims. Photographs placed people in locations that conflicted with stories they had heard. Messages revealed how the same event had been described differently to different relatives. As the pieces came together, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Ryan remained standing near the head of the table. His eyes moved slowly from one page to another. Several times he picked up a document, read it carefully, then placed it back down. He looked as though he were trying to reconcile two different versions of reality. Across from him, Ashley appeared quieter than I had ever seen her. She occasionally attempted to explain a detail or clarify a misunderstanding, but the explanations seemed less convincing now that everyone could compare them directly with the records in front of them. What struck me most was not anyone's reaction to Ashley. It was their reaction to themselves. Relatives began remembering conversations. Old assumptions suddenly looked different. Questions that had once seemed settled reopened. My cousin Rebecca quietly admitted that she had accepted certain stories without ever asking where they came from. Emily confessed that she had noticed inconsistencies months earlier, but assumed there must be a reasonable explanation. Around the table, people were not discovering a single shocking secret. They were discovering how easily perception can be shaped over time. Eventually, Ryan sat down and rested his hands on the table. The room became still. When he finally spoke, His voice sounded strained. He admitted that he should have looked more closely at what was happening. He admitted that he had dismissed concerns because doing so was easier than questioning the version of events he had accepted. Hearing those words brought me no satisfaction. I had imagined this moment many times during the previous months. In those imagined versions, I thought I would feel vindicated, triumphant. Instead, I felt something much quieter. Relief. The exhausting weight I had been carrying for so long finally began to lift. The conversation continued for another hour. People compared memories. Dates were checked. Messages were reviewed. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody created a dramatic scene. The truth had already done what it needed to do. By the end of the evening, the atmosphere in the room felt completely different from when I arrived. The certainty that once surrounded the accusations had disappeared. In its place was understanding. As relatives slowly gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, several stopped to speak with me privately. Some apologized. Others simply thanked me for remaining patient when it would have been easier to walk away. Outside, the air felt cool and peaceful as I stepped onto the front porch. Summer was beginning to fade. Somewhere in the distance, crickets chirped beneath the darkening sky. Ryan followed me outside a few minutes later. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he apologized again. This time there was no audience. No documents. No discussion. Just the son speaking honestly to his mother. We stood together beneath the porch light for several minutes before I finally started toward my car. As I drove home through the quiet streets, I thought about everything that had happened. Being right had never been the goal. The goal had always been the truth. Truth is not loud. It does not force itself into the room. It waits, patiently. And sooner or later, when enough facts gather in one place, people finally see what was there all along.